evening, everyone. Welcome to Opera America. This is our final event of the season, Making Connections, the singer-director relationship. My name is Lindsay Working. I'm Artistic Services Manager here. I would like to say hello to all of you, but I'm also going to welcome our audience that's online, because it is being streamed on our website. Before we get started, I just want to remind you to turn off your cell phones, just so they don't disturb our conversation. And then before we get started with the conversation, I just want to take a quick poll of how many singers we have in the room. Okay, 3 and 4. And directors, we have 2. Okay, perfect. So just so you're aware, there's going to be some time for question and answer afterwards. If you think of any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce the lovely panelists. To my right, we have Sari Gruber, soprano, Kevin Newbury, stage director, and Nancy Rhodes, who is stage director. And what's your title at Encompass New Opera Theater?
Artistic director.
Artistic director. So welcome to you all. So just as we get started with the conversation, when I think about the singer-director relationship, I start thinking about the rehearsal process. And when I did theater in college, it was really interesting because you're working with these people who you may not have met before, and you're working in a usually pretty tight rehearsal period and very concentrated, and it can be really great because you make really good friends very quickly, or it can be very, very challenging because you might not get along with someone as well as you would hope. So with that in mind, I think there are 3 key elements to successful artistic collaborations. There's trust, respect, and preparation. And before we get going on kind of trust and respect, because I think those are a little bit more difficult to handle, I thought we would start with preparation. So I'm going to start with Kevin and Nancy on this one. It's the first day of staging rehearsals. What do you expect your cast members to have prepared before they come into the rehearsal hall?
Well, I have very high expectations. I mean, not only should they know their music and know all of their libretto and words and everything, but I expect them to have really researched the role and the project and the time period. And I think that the biggest gift you can have as a director is a very intellectually curious cast. And that's what really turns me on about working with really smart singers, that they come into the room and they actually have spent some time thinking about the context and the character and the place in history, and of course they know their music is very helpful too. But I expect them to really engage the material ahead of time and really have an interest in it. It's kind of an ongoing liberal arts education in what we do, and so that's the first thing that I hope for and expect.
What about you, Nancy?
Well, ditto, exactly. Intellectually and being curious about what the piece is about from a spiritual and internal motivational aspect. Very, very important. Certainly being totally prepared from the libretto, from researching if it's a new work, researching the social, historical aspects, anything that the singer can bring to the situation is vital. So I do expect them to come prepared if it's a staging rehearsal, to have it memorized, the scenes that we're going to work on. It just makes it a lot more valuable in exploring and finding characterizations and so forth.
One of my big philosophies is that the best idea wins. So the more ideas there are in the room, the more good ideas you have to choose from. And I think that's a big part of collaboration, is seeing what everyone brings to the table.
And Sherry, what about you? Do you have expectations of the director before, when you're showing up to the rehearsal? Are there things that you expect the director to have for you, or?
Well, yes, much along the same line. I expect them to know, the libretto and the music, and many times we're dealing with subtext in the music and what the gesture of that is. Obviously, they have the whole technical aspect, but I expect them to be as prepared as I am. So, and again, that has to be a very mutual thing, mutual respect, mutual trust, mutual level of preparation. That doesn't mean everybody's going to agree on everything all the time. And I think we all welcome differences in opinion to be aired, because that's part of the fun of the process. One has to be flexible, but one has to have a clear idea of the piece and how one feels about the piece and what some of the options are, if not making some decisions about some things you would like to see happen.
And obviously it depends on the size of the role and the entire opera, but how much time typically do you give yourself to prepare from when you first find out you're being cast to how much time do you plan in advance before you go into those staging rehearsals?
Personally, I like to have at least 6 months from the moment I'm given a contract, and usually it's longer than that, but I usually don't really get to it if I'm working on something else until about 6 months before, beyond maybe listening to it, reading libretto. I like to let things fester and digest in there a lot. So, but around 6 months, I'll start to really plug away at the piece, start doing major, research on the time period or the composer, or, I just did Pearl Fishers, so trying to do some research on what the Pearl Fishers did and what is Hinduism and things like this, and what some of the dance gestures are that I might be called on to do, things like that, in addition to actually sitting down, translating the score, looking at the vocal demands, taking it to teachers, coaches, things like that. But ideally 6 months to just get all that information in the head, in the body, in the heart.
And during that time, this is for all of you, is it ever appropriate for a singer to contact a director during the preparation time?
Oh, I love that. I mean, I love sitting down and having dinner with singers ahead of time. And I find that it only happens usually with more famous singers to have approval of their clothes or that sort of a thing. But I wish it happened more often. I wish that there was an opportunity to really sit down and talk about something, especially, it happens more with world premieres. I do a lot of world premieres, and that tends to be something that we'll have a workshop a year or two ahead of time, and then we can actually sit down and talk about it. But if we were going to be doing, let's say, a Figaro together, we wouldn't sit down and talk ahead of time unless we knew each other, and then we would. But it's pretty rare for a singer and a director to have time ahead of time. Unfortunately, I wish it happened more often. Has that been your experience too?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would, again, ditto, we're like to have the opportunity to discuss one-on-one with the singer about the role, what their thoughts are, what my thoughts are as the director, and looking at the piece before you get into the rehearsal process is a great opportunity to really bat around ideas, get other input from the singer, and establish some trust and some ways of communication that will then carry into the rehearsal process. And I, like you, I love when a singer wants to discuss the role prior. That is worth its weight in gold.
Kevin, you touched on new works a little bit. Do you feel, and Sari, Nancy, do you feel that the preparation for new works is different than it is for standard repertoire, or is it, how so?
Well, fundamentally it's the same. You're trying to tell a clear story and you're working with designers, but if you have a living composer and librettist, it's much different and it's much more exciting, much more thrilling. I mean, if I could do new work all the time, I would, and I'm doing new work about 70% of the time now, and I love it, and I think it's so a big part of the future of this industry is investing our time and our talent and energy into the future of the art form. But it is twice as much work, I mean, for sure, because you're dealing with living writers, and it's sort of like having a whole new set of boyfriends and girlfriends calling at, not at all hours, but that are, part of the whole process. And I love every moment of it, but it's certainly more time-consuming.
Do you feel the same way, Nancy? You work a lot with new works.
I would say that, it's, what can you say? It's a process of, part of the time is working in developing the piece, maybe through a series of workshops, developmental aspects with the composer and the librettist to get the work to the point where it's ready for full production. And that in itself is a process, and then many times there are singers along the way that have helped develop that piece. And if possible, I like to involve them in the world premiere because they've invested the time in the development process and brought ideas to the table. Then there is the rehearsal process of bringing something completely new. And so it gives a little more time for exploration. Nobody's done it before, so you have to really dig in and create that vibrancy, and you have the composer, librettist there, oftentimes giving input. So the collaboration aspects are really great. And then there's the promotion of a new work. So it involves another whole opportunity for interconnecting the artist with the audience, which I think is so important in bringing new work, new opera to the field, is to connect the artistic energy and creativity that went into that with the audience, so they begin to really wrap themselves around the process and the aspects. It's not like recreating a work that's established as a masterpiece. This is another whole energy and field that needs to be recognized.
And Sari, I'm not familiar with all of your roles, but have you had the chance to work on something?
Not as many as
As
I'd
you
like,
would like to.
but early on in my career, I had the opportunity to do a premiere of one of Tobias Picker's operas called Fantastic Mr. Fox, of the Roald Dahl story, and it was a fascinating experience because we were at LA Opera, which was a large company, so it was my first time at a company that size. We were doing this premiere. Tobias was in the room. I mean, but it was such a fabulous experience because it was. You don't often get to feel like you're the first one walking in the sand. Do you know what I mean? And that it was just that feeling that your tracks were going to be, in virgin territory, and it was so much fun because there were no expectations, there were no traditions that you were following or breaking, or it just was what it was, and it was a fabulous piece. I wish it were done more often, actually. It just recently was done in Pittsburgh, of all places, by one of the smaller opera companies, and I think it's been done some in the UK.
Yeah, they're doing it in London.
Yeah, but it hasn't had as much of a life as I think it should. I think it's a fabulous piece, and it was a huge popular hit in LA. Separate story. But anyway, but the actual experience of it was fabulous because you feel like you have a direct hand in how this music happens, and if something needs to change, either in terms of the timing or something, I'd like to have 3 bars over here. I just need to extend that more. Tobias is right there. He says, okay, So it was glorious, and many times we feel like we have to be so dutiful to history, or we're doing something to flip it upside down, to refreshen an old work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so nice to feel like you can forge a path and do something that nobody's ever done before. And then opening night for a premiere is one of the most incredible experiences, I'm sure, for you guys as well.
Absolutely.
And it's,
And so when you're preparing for a premiere, you're the first person who's directed it, you're the first person who's sung this role. In a way, that gives you freedom, and you're free to do what you want. But the flip side of that, is it a little bit daunting to know that it's kind of in your hands? The first spin out on the stage is left to you.
I mean, it's a little daunting, but it's also liberating. I think if I'm doing a production of Bohème, there's all that pressure of realizing what every other director has done before and studying it and then having a real new point of view, but also making sure that you're not inadvertently copying what somebody did 30 years ago. And instead of looking at a new piece and saying, how can I tell this story in the clearest way possible? And as Sari was saying, they're not going to compare it to other productions. It happens to singers and directors. How does so-and-so's production or version of a role compare to the predecessor? So I find it liberating, and I love it.
And also you get the sensation that, and I know you guys have this feeling, that everyone is just on pins and needles listening. We're all trained in diction and everything, and generally the words are coming across very well. But everyone is really just wondering and what's happening next, and really hanging onto the story. And that is something you don't always get when you're doing Rigoletto. And they saw it 5 years ago, and Malcolm is in the front going, So, even with the best productions, sometimes simply because they've seen it before, they're not as involved. They have subscriptions. We hope that they are excited, but with a new work, they are really there. They might hate it, they might love it, but they're involved and they're reacting to it rather than letting it pass over, which I think is the danger, particularly with doing very traditional productions. You know.
Does it open up the door for more disagreement between the director and the singer about the interpretation of the role because there is not a performance history behind it?
Quite the contrary, I would think, actually.
Yeah, because they're not going to come in having done Susanna 100 times before, which is also exciting because you bring ideas to that, but it's not. I think it puts everybody on an even playing field in a way. I don't know. You might direct everything the same way and the same approach, I think. But
Yeah, I think when you have the writers there, the creators, there is another layer, and if they're involved in the rehearsal process, there is another layer because when they're writing something, they have oftentimes something very particular in their mind, and then the director and designers and so forth and the singers come in, and maybe it's shaping in a way that's not exactly what they had in their mind, and so they could need adjustments and questions and other and I find that exciting because then, as you were saying, Kevin, you get a lot of input and more ideas in a way can be healthy, provided the director really has a firm vision, underlying idea of really where they want to take that work, and focus that piece dramatically and so forth. But yeah, I think it stirs the brew a little bit to have that kind of opportunity.
Nancy, you touched on trust earlier on when I was talking about the first stage rehearsal and how you like to establish that. In theater, it's typical to play games and kind of have these opening things you get to do together as an ensemble to get to know one another and start building that trust. I find that in opera you don't always have the time to do that, and it's not always as expected. Kevin and Nancy, are there ways that you try and create the trust, or how do you go about that?
I think this is really, really important. And first of all, I would just like to say that I think of myself, I think the singer is the central being in a work. They're out there on that stage ultimately, and they're the ones carrying that show. So when I think about my relationship with a singer, I see us as equals. Mm-hmm. It's my job to have the vision, to have thought everything through from top to bottom, to have ideas, to make a safe environment for the singer to be able to step out of their comfort zone, to make interconnections with each other. So I do, as many times, do theater games and certain exercises that sort of bring an equal layer of reality to the first couple of rehearsals. I do like to meet with the singer one-on-one prior to rehearsals because that gives us an opportunity to establish a rapport, and it gives me an opportunity to get all their ideas and for me to transmit mine. But I feel it very important to establish a collaborative, safe environment for the singer to let their hair down, get in, dig in, and bring their heart, their soul to the process. Now, I know it's not always, sometimes it's difficult when you're in big arena with very, important, people have their public face on, and how do you get past that? But I think that for me is really key.
I agree, and the first day is it's a constant first day of school for all of us, whether you're a singer or a director. And I come from a family of teachers, and so I always have those kind of nightmares of the first day of school before the first day of rehearsal. But because that's really the very important day to establish that trust, and I think that's why I always insist on everyone being there on the first day. I don't mind releases during the process. People can go do their auditions or whatever, but on the first day, I really want everyone in the same room together so we can really just arrive on the same page about our vision for the work. And I like doing table work and having discussions about the piece, but only for one day. I mean, not some directors do it for days. I like to get on my feet and start working. And I tend to weave in exercises into the staging rehearsals and stuff, so we'll try different things, and it depends on the piece. I mean, I'll do an ensemble-based piece sometimes where everybody's on stage the whole time, but I wouldn't do necessarily a Rigoletto that way or something, and so it just depends on what the form and the content is, but I think that first day is so crucial. And if everyone can leave after that first day feeling excited, I want the singers to feel like they're in really good, capable hands, of course. I want them to feel fearless to come in the next day and act ridiculous, and to trust me that I won't let them go on stage looking ridiculous. And I think that the first, it's all about that first day and getting everyone excited about it.
It's so true. Because for us, if we do not feel safe, the art stops.
Exactly.
And, you know, it's something that I hear from my colleagues who sing at a lot of the big houses. It's like, you can't make art when your knees are knocking together. And there are some people who can make you feel very safe in that environment, but a lot of people who survive in that environment have nerves of steel. You know, you have to be programmed a certain way or a certain kind of thoroughbred. And I think regardless of what level you're on, knowing that you're going to a first day of rehearsal is nerve-wracking. You know, you're going to be sized up, you're going to be sizing everybody else up, and the sooner you can feel off of that guard, the better it's going to be. And the best collaborations come from somebody who's like, take my hand, let's just make art together. There's no putting people down. There's no feeling that you can't raise a concern. There's no feeling that you can't fight strongly for an idea that you feel is important. There's no feeling that you can't try something and suddenly be won over by it. I have a 3-time rule with a director. I have to, if at first it kind of feels funny, try it 3 times, walk it, put it in your body, and then see if it works. And generally it does. Even if you have this initial like I don't know, but you have to try it. And if you are willing to collaborate, if you're with, you know, wonderful directors who are willing to collaborate from the get-go, you're in a very fortunate situation, and those moments are to be cherished.
And as important as art and music is, it's also supposed to be fun, because we all get into this business because we enjoy it. We can make a whole lot more money doing something else. And so I want people to actually enjoy being in rehearsal and to encourage making jokes, and I'm a big pop culture person, talk about movies and music videos and not just talk about Mozart, and, you know, and really open it up for people to bring in their own experiences. And there's a weird disconnect between theater and opera too. I direct a lot of plays too, and theater people come in ready to make choices, to try something that's going to be terrible and then try something that might work. And I feel like, although it's getting better in the opera industry, I feel like singers come in and sometimes feel like they have to have it down already because they've learned it, they know their music, whether they've done the production or not, they're kind of ready to stage the first scene the first day, and then we'll stage the second scene. And it's like, no, actually, it's a choices. What choice do you want to make? What choice do we want to make as directors? And which choice is the most interesting one that, as you said, Nancy, underlies the vision that we bring to the table? But if we're not having fun, if I have 3 shows in a row where I'm not having fun, I'll do something else. I mean, it's really, and I only like to work with people that I like having around.
You know, that's one thing I look for in a singer when they come to audition. Do they have a sense of humor?
Absolutely.
Because, you know, when the going gets tough, a sense of humor is a great thing to have. And you do need to have fun. If we don't have fun in creating, bringing life to whatever piece we're working on, then we might as well be doing something else.
It's a long song.
It's a long
It's a
song.
long song. And people do better work when they feel like they've been part of the process. I mean, it's a very simple recipe, I think, that if they have some ownership over it and they felt good about the process, they'll give a better performance. I mean, there are a lot of, like, how do I say it, a lot of jerk, you know, bad, mean screamers out there that still get good results somehow, but that's, I don't know how that works. Like, it don't work that way.
Well, and I have to say,
I was going to say, how do you deal with that if you're in that situation where, you, as you said, you don't feel safe and you don't necessarily have that trust?
well,
There are people who are in that situation. How do you get through that?
There are things that they're tools. I actually sometimes feel like my colleagues and I should get together and put tools together and make a book. Exactly. I was just, actually, I had a 2.5-hour lunch with a colleague today about this very same thing, and she's had 4 gigs where she's had horrible, horrible experiences. experiences with the director, one after the other, and one of them, he threw a fake snake at her head and laughed, and the administrators of the company, I'm not kidding you, we're sitting in the rehearsal and did nothing about it, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. It's just like one of those things. So there are many abuses. And I think singers come into that first day of school with a lot of because of whatever prior experience has happened, some punitive thing that was said or some way that they were degraded. And that's unfortunate. And I wish you guys could be directing every production that I were doing or all of my colleagues. But there are those really rough experiences. And you have to not take it personally, even though we're trying to give the most personal gift that we have, which is our voice and our bodies and our expression. And we have to use our colleagues for support. Many times they're feeling the same thing. So there many times can be a tremendous support system in your colleagues. Not always, but I find that we tend to stick together, particularly when things like that happen. And you really, that's one of those things when you have to do what the director says, even if you make up your own subtext, to go through the paces that the director wants you to. And you do it with as much pleasantry as possible. At that point, you just have to be a pro. And you just do your job. Horrible experiences like that are few. However, there are experiences where the director comes in and is just unprepared, is reading the liner notes, doesn't know the language, thinks that the Ruth and Thomas Martin translation is what's actually in the Italian. And there are major directors that I've worked with that work under that assumption. And you see those liner notes come out and you're like, I'm done.
I know, right? It's so true.
I'm done. Trust is gone.
And they come out a lot.
Yeah, and then you end up staging yourself with your colleagues. You're like, okay, I'm going to go here, you're going to go there. Okay, cool. Seriously, it ends up happening that way. And then the director gets credit for a production that worked. And you sit there just banging your head against the wall. And I'm thinking of one instance in particular.
No naming names, it's the camera's there.
No, there's no name.
The camera wasn't going, maybe.
There's no name. But the first hour of staging rehearsal, and I don't mean to go into war stories, I feel like I need a cigarette drag. But it's, this director sat there for the first hour of staging after the production presentation, reading through the liner notes, and then finally said, I'm just not in the space. And the next day, same thing, liner notes. Just start singing. And it was Janacek. And so it was, and this person ended up getting good reviews. So that's one of those things where you're just like, why? But at the same time, we all were just pros about it. We made the show work because we wanted it to work for us. Mm-hmm. We wanted it to work for the company. We wanted it to work because we all believed in the piece. And so it worked. The wrong person got the credit for it, but it worked. Is it one of those things that everybody in the cast, from that cast, sees each other across the room and are like, remember that? Yes. But again, those are very few. But we all have experiences like that along the line that inform that first day when we're like, oh, don't you bring out those liner notes?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course we have that too. I mean, sometimes singers, I've had really good luck with singers for the most part, but once in a while you get somebody who just doesn't want to work, doesn't want to be there, or just doesn't engage, or has a very different interpretation, and it can be really, really difficult, but you just have to put your game face on and make it happen. At the end of the day, they have to want to do the show.
So when that happens, though, if you have one cast member who really isn't pulling their weight, but everybody else is on board and it's really collaborative, it can be really damaging to the overall morale because everyone else is putting in 100% and this other person is not prepared. Do you address that?
I try to get them fired. No, I'm just kidding. Only sometimes, once in a while.
How do you address
well,
that?
it's just like what Sari was saying. What happens is people end up forming factions, and you have to try to mitigate that as a director. But it's very clear that first day, let's say the director and most of the cast are getting along quite well, and then one singer is proving quite difficult, then it ends up being different teams and stuff, and that can be really hard too. It can be really challenging when someone in the room is really not liked by everybody else in the room, no matter which side of the table they're on.
Well, one thing I've discovered, if a singer is having some of these problems, there generally is something going on. Either they may really be having trouble learning the music or whatever. And since I do a lot of 21st century works, you know, the rhythms and very tight harmonies, and if they are coming from a background of doing mostly 19th century bel canto style, and then they're doing something very contemporary, it can be a real jump. And so when that has happened, then I generally assess what's going on, and then I think, okay, they need some extra musical coaching to kind of get them up to where they need to go, and that often does help. Sometimes, as you were saying, there's a singer who just doesn't want to engage for whatever reason is going on inside of them, and then you just have to pull, work with everyone else and go and try to pull them in, and usually the rest of the team will rally and take care of that situation. But I want to make the point that opera singing, musical theater performance for singers is truly a complex art form. And having taught at Manhattan School of Music for 12 years, acting for singers, and finding all the steps of what it takes to layer in a performance, it really is a very challenging art form. And sometimes you really have to separate out the musical preparation, where it's just working on rhythms, the notes, etc., and then beginning to take in the text itself, the libretto, etc. And then there's all of the acting skill. And many years ago, I was trained in theater, although I have a long musical background, studied piano for 14 years, and sang myself with groups way back when. But I took what I learned in theater school, and adapted it for singers, and developed that probably with some guinea pigs at Manhattan School of Music. But that is something that I, as a director, am very aware of what it takes to turn out a performance on the stage, the complexity of it. And so in dealing with some of the realities of rehearsal process, sometimes singers can meet up against a point where the door just slightly closes, and you have to then come in on a human level and take somebody aside and say, hey, what's going on? Is there something, and many times there is something going on a personal level that's finding its way into the rehearsal process. And then you have to start being a psychologist.
Stick to recital.
You don't want to have to do that, but sometimes you do for the greater whole. But I just want to go back again to the safety net issue, the safety issue. In hearing what you were saying, Sari, I mean, it's incredible, the fear that we as artists can bring, because we all want to communicate, we want to express ourselves, we want it to be good, we want it to be great, and the reality is, we just have to be who we are. We have to take the material and try to bring some truth, some authenticity, some interconnection with each other on that stage, to listen, to open our heart to that music and let the music breathe. One of my former students that was in our production recently of the Gertrude Stein pieces that we did at Symphony Space, he said, Nancy, he said, I studied opera, but I've gone much more into musical theater, into straight plays. And he said, the thing about opera, he said, that drives me crazy, he says, it doesn't let you breathe. There doesn't seem like just to breathe. feel, to let that music come into all the 7 energy centers of our being, to just let it breathe. There's a sense of sometimes forcing the sound, forcing the vocal mechanism, making something much bigger than it really is meant to be. Just allow it to be is something that is partly a cultural thing. You know, we have huge opera houses. I mean, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 seat theaters, but opera in 19th century Europe was built for small theaters that would be that would hold a human voice properly. And so now we have these very large theaters around the country, large orchestras, and then a human voice having to project over all of that. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think part of what's hard about the larger venue is the loss of intimacy that you have musically, dramatically, and the relationship you have over the course of an evening with an audience, because you can feel when they're there. You might not see them all, but you can feel it. And in a large hall, it's harder to get. It is what it is in this country. And I'm not going to get into the whole vocal discussion of whether it's ruining our voices, which I think it's certainly not helping, because we're all having to just jam over that wall of an open pit that's in front of us, and the instruments are getting higher and higher and louder since the 19th century when a lot of these pieces were written. That's a separate panel. That'll be next year. But I think that the greatest loss is the sense that you as an artist have someone just out of your reach that you're having a conversation with over the course of an evening. And that you, in a strange way, have, a relationship with, even though they're across the fourth wall. But they're, in a sense, they're in on your subtext. They're in your living room as you're going through these life-shattering or ecstatic moments. They're with you every moment. And if there are 5,000 of them, it's very hard to feel like you are reaching those people. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that there's, going back to what this colleague of yours said about breathing in opera, I don't know exactly what he was referring to, but I do know that there's a lot of pressure for us to feel like we're heard in these houses. You know, and I remember as a young singer, someone who's an artistic director still at a very large house in this country said, well, you know, your voice is too small, you'll never be heard of in an orchestra. Dear Mr. So-and-so, I will be making my New York City opera debut. This stage was built for a ballet theater and they heard me. You know? But it was one of those things, I was like, how can you say this to a young singer? Mm-hmm. You know? Yeah. I mean, maybe not always have the biggest voices. That doesn't make us bad artists. Mm-hmm. Just because your house is huge. So I understand. You have to hire different people for that kind of a situation. You would hire a different Susanna for a 5,000-seat house than you would for a 1,000-seat house. Absolutely. But it, I think, makes us feel even more like we are in a deficit situation, that we are not enough. And we have that feeling already. We can't hear ourselves. We can't see ourselves. And lucky we are if we, get to work with directors like you, whom we can trust and who can be our eyes. We work internally. Sometimes we have that third-person thing going on where we're watching ourselves from outside, but many times that takes a while to get to that comfort level as an artist. And so we really rely on you in the same way that we rely on our coaches and our voice teachers. And it's an emotional safety issue in order to bridge that step from the book to the stage. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have that, as we discussed before, that the shutters close and it becomes very difficult. And then again, we have a hard time reaching out there because we have that many more tensions built into the process. So it's really integral to the process to have this relationship where you can speak honestly and proactively about the piece. Doesn't mean you always have to agree, mm-hmm. but you have to be willing to collaborate. And if you don't have that kind of collaboration, I don't know what you do have.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah. Big house or small.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about the director being your
seeing how it looks, the other side of that is that the director might not know how it feels on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had a situation where you get on stage during tech rehearsal and you just there's a really steep rake or the stairs and your costume is really big and you just feel uncomfortable?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's appropriate to address that with the director?
Yeah, many times the director will take you on stage before any kind of run happens of the scene. So you could, particularly if you have a very cumbersome costume sometimes, so you get to try out any stairs or, these days there are more and more rakes in the rehearsal hall, because it makes such a difference. But until you get on the stage, a lot of the spacing things, you don't really know how it feels to have things. So the small adjustments are made. I never have a problem bringing something up. I'll try it if the director really insists on having it there. My main thing on the stage is safety issue. And I've been in a number of situations where it's been very dangerous, and scenic designers of note have done things that have been dangerous, and I've slipped and fallen, or I've almost fallen off in performance, and like the hand of God, or grabbed me because they refused to put a little lip on the edge of the stage. Things like this that I asked for, that wouldn't have disturbed the scenic vision at all, but they were simply a safety issue, haven't been done, and it's very frustrating when the director or scenic designer does not see that it's a safety problem. And we're many times out in the dark, sometimes up on these kind of precipitous things, and we're jumping around, or we're turning, or we have costumes. We have so many things to think about in addition to singing. And if we feel like we're not being listened to when it comes to simple safety issues, and I'm not saying you need to be namby-pamby. Like, if you're afraid of heights, you're in the wrong career. You just are. You're going to be up on a platform, and you're either going to suck it up, or you're going to have a problem every single time. I'm afraid of heights. I'm still singing. I just deal with it. But when it's a genuine safety concern, something that could go wrong, and nothing is done about it, that's another one of those things where it's like, okay.
And I try to be really proactive about it. It's just the same thing about people feeling comfortable with what they're doing. So when you move on stage, I ask the singers, how does it feel up there?
Mm-hmm.
You feel good singing up there? How does your dress feel? It looks fantastic. I know the footlights are a little bright.
Thanks for saying that. We always like that.
But people, you need to hear that. Want to feel good about what you're doing. Or, I agree, that color's terrible. We'll find something else. And I know the footlights are really bright, but it looks so cool. If there's a point you can't see the conductor, we'll take it down 10%, and all that kind of stuff, so that it opens the door for good communication. Mm-hmm. Although I do prefer those conversations to happen as a sidebar, unless it's a safety issue, as you said, but as opposed to stopping rehearsal and saying, I can't walk backwards in my dress, and that kind of thing. And well, again, maybe stick to recitals.
But sometimes you find out things in that first dress rehearsal.
Exactly.
We went to this Pearl Fishers recently. I was in a beautiful glass beaded dress.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even think in the costume fittings, with all the throwing around of laid
That's
off,
right.
that would become an issue. And all of a sudden in the first rehearsal, I had glass beads in my knee.
Yeah, that's terrible.
In my
that's
hip.
terrible.
And it was one of those things, I was like, I'm sorry, I need to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm bleeding,
Yeah.
And I didn't even connect the two. We ended up scratching the dress, which I was very disappointed about.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things like, I really wanted it to work.
Yeah.
And I think when things like that happen, I think singers are actually apologetic because they don't want it to not work.
Right.
They do want it to work, but sometimes, practically speaking, it's just not possible in the original version.
And any chance for the singer to work with that dress or the place that's high up on stage before you get to the running it in context makes such a difference. Yeah. If you can get that dress in rehearsal, try to get that dress in rehearsal if they're rolling around on the floor, and show them where that high spot is, or what does it feel like to be wheeled around. Like, I try to get everything in rehearsal that I possibly can, and I love things on wheels that are constantly in motion, so if I'm going to ask someone to ride around on things all night long while they're singing, they need to rehearse with their front mind.
Absolutely.
And so I insist, and the costumes are a really big thing. Anytime you're doing something really challenging, especially in period clothes, but even if it's a 1980s miniskirt, whatever it is, have those things in rehearsal to start playing with. And even if the unions are complaining about it, it's still really important that you don't see it for the first time in front of a room full of people.
Well, footwear and any kind of costume pieces really important to have in the rehearsal process, and, from almost the beginning. And I agree with Kevin. I try to have as much, at least a facsimile, in the rehearsal process, because there's not going to be time during the tech to put that all together, because at that point there's so many other things to deal with. And just getting back to the safety issue, that is really, really a serious thing. And I don't know, maybe I'm one of these people. I walk the stage. Oftentimes I see obstacle courses where singers come in and out that the stage manager didn't see.
Yeah, I do that
And
too.
I wonder what's going on in their mind, because I'm very aware of clearing out and that everything is as safe as possible for singers, because as I said earlier, they're at the end of the day, they're the ones that bring that show across. That is really the truth. And of course, we're there orchestrating it and putting and bringing everything else to bear. But ultimately, they walk out on that stage and have to deliver, and that's a major thing.
And these days, there are very few covers these days, so you don't need anyone going down the stairs and missing performances. I mean, that's a very superficial thing, but everybody's health and safety is so important. And yeah, I do the same thing. I walk around and I'll say, I'm sure you're going to put the glow tape here, but just making sure. I noticed. And not trying to do your job.
So what do you do if there's a big difference in the interpretation of the role between the director and the singer is really adamant, or the director is really adamant, and it just doesn't feel honest from your point of view? Maybe we'll start with Sari.
As I said earlier, because the director has the entire thing in the vision, and hopefully that director has come with a vision, so we're going to work under the assumption that there are no liner notes involved, but there's a real vision at play. I try very hard to try everything that's being asked of me. If it's really not working after my magic 3 tries, I'll talk about it. And it's really, can you help me? I want this to work. I want your vision to work, because I believe in it. And I'm not being, a BS artist about that. I really, I do want it to work. Again, they see the big picture. And just to maybe just talk through a different subtext that will get me in the same place. A different subtext than I'd originally envisioned, or just a slightly different arc of hitting the same mark. So, and I found that incredibly helpful, rather than being resistant and being like, nope, that's not how it's done, And sometimes you'll see that with established artists who've done a role 1,800 times. They're like, no, this is what I do. This is my such and such a role. I don't want to do that. That's not the kind of artist I am. And so I always try it. And I've done some pretty funky versions of standard pieces, and I always find it fascinating. And I find those different readings of those pieces in my interpretation and in my body for years after, in the best way. And I love taking the plunge like that. And so it's really just a matter of saying, please help me. But many times if it's presented in a way, it just kind of makes sense anyway. If you've had your presentation and you understand what the director's after, sometimes you don't have to ask them, but when you do, just talk. Mm-hmm. Obviously if you have a collegial situation, just ask questions. Everybody wants you to succeed, and you want them to succeed, and nobody's trying to be anybody's enemy. So, in good situations, obviously.
And like any situation in life, it's about compromise. And I think that without it being a very specific quid pro quo, if you roll around on the floor while you sing this aria, I'll let you take the jacket off when you enter up there. It's not like that. But there is something to, if you give a little bit on this, then a singer is more apt to do something a little bit more outside of their comfort zone and try it and get comfortable with it. And I find that as long as you listen and ask questions and you're willing to compromise. And my favorite opening night is when I genuinely lose track of what idea came from where. And I see a performance up there of, let's say, soprano, and that it's exactly the interpretation that I was hoping for, but it's been enriched by her choices, and that she feels ownership over it. And I can't remember if some beautiful gesture or some acting choice came from her or from me, and that's my favorite kind of opening night. And as long as people are willing to collaborate and try things, I rarely run into that. I feel like I can even, I have productions that are going to lots of companies now. I'm fortunate, but I have different casts coming in. And sometimes you have to, as a director, you have to kill your darlings, and same thing as a singer, that I'll have a moment that works so perfectly the last time I did the production, and the singer feels it a little bit differently, and it's, I have to compromise too and let that moment go, and let that bright footlight go, or whatever it may be. But it always ends up being a representation, I think, of what I intended. I don't know, I've been fortunate with great singers, so I've had really good luck.
Yeah, but I think we all have to trust each other person's instinct, and that we have strong instincts about the movement in the piece on the broad scale as well as the small scale. And again, it comes down to trust and respect. And if you employ that, then it's going to turn out fine.
Right.
If everybody is able to really just let loose, because that is what's speaking to them.
My parents brought me up to choose my battles. I had a younger sister. My mother said all the time when I was a kid, choose your battles, don't fight about everything. And isn't that the truth? Whatever you do for a living, but especially in the arts, when we're all crazy and emotional, loose cannons, and and I mean that with the utmost respect and love, because I'm the same way, but there's a lot of big personalities in the room, and you have to choose your battles. If you're a singer or a director and you fight about everything, or every time you feel a little insecure, you speak up about everything, then nothing's going to get done. So, I don't know. It's my philosophy.
Yeah. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Please.
I have a question for the directors and a question for Sari. I find that one of the most difficult things to direct opera singers in is the non-singing moments, when someone's on stage for the whole aria of the other singer, and it's kind of taking away their main tool. And also for the director, it's more difficult because often there is nothing in the piece or in the notes at that moment telling you what the other character is doing. So wanted to know how you deal with that. Is it something that bothers you, or is it something that is less important because at that moment the focus is on the singing person anyway?
Go ahead, you want to say?
Well, sometimes the hardest job can be to really listen. If you're the other person in the scene and the main soprano or tenor or whoever, it has the words and the other one is listening. But if the other singer is really listening and responding within that, subtly perhaps, however interconnected it may be, that will come to life because it's real. Someone's saying something and someone is listening and responding. There may be times where it's a farce or something where you want some kind of a reaction, and then the director and the actor can make that happen by business or whatever to incorporate that into. But something, it's not like the other singer just sort of tunes out and thinks about the laundry list. If they really want to be bringing the whole piece to life, they have to actually be listening and responding. And listening can be very powerful on stage if it's really happening and it's interconnected with what's going on.
I agree.
My favorite moment as a singer is when I get to listen. I absolutely love it.
And I think that also good storytelling is good storytelling. So in answer to your question, I think there's a fine, to reiterate what Nancy and Sari are saying, but there's a lot of possibilities between I'm going to sing while the person stands here and listens in a very old-fashioned Met staging kind of way, and having them run around distracting and really detracting from what's happening with the person who's singing. There's a whole range of possibilities in there, and I think that if you have a natural listener, Shari's a great singing actress. I've seen her before. I'm a fan. She knows, you're a really good actor and singer on stage. So when you have that, there are endless possibilities. If somebody really doesn't know how to listen, sometimes you have to teach that a little bit, like how to be interesting and not be distracting, and make them watch The Silence of the Lambs and watch Jodie Foster listening to Anthony Hopkins. I mean, it's like, it's all in the eyes, right? Just as an example, I mean, it's all in the eyes and listening, the whole inner life of what's happening when someone else is singing. But I find that I like to keep things animated so that the moments of stillness really resonate, whether you're doing Philip Glass or Donizetti, whatever it is, that I think that sometimes giving somebody something to do, you know, a prop as they're listening. Again, there's a lot of possibilities that don't end up being distracting, hopefully, but it can be hard. I mean, it's you know,
Good question.
it's a very good question.
Well, I think for the singer, for us, we feel so in the moment when we're active in our art. And I think teaching a way to stay in the moment, as actors would say, staying in character. I'm not one of these character actors who's in character for 2 weeks during a production, but you have to stay in the moment always. The moment that stops from anybody on stage, that something sags in the energy. So it's everybody's job, whether you're a chorister listening to, you know, somebody in a Verdi opera announcing something, to, you know, a very intimate scene. You have to be in the moment. You have to be there as if you were there. We listen to each other all the time.
Sure,
Why
but
not on stage?
of course, but like the only thing is that in opera, you know, time tends to get stretched. Like when you're doing an aria, and it exits the normal bounds of time. That's why I think it's harder than in theater, for example.
Yeah, but also realize that the subtext is being stretched, and that subtext may be in the orchestra for the listener too. So, and I think we have to figure out a way to breathe into that. To use our breath, to use this part of our body to get into that energy. I know that sounds kind of woo-woo.
Sounds great.
And opera's filled with like out-of-body experiences.
Yeah.
It's filled with really emotional internal monologues. So really, in some ways, I find it I love directing plays too, but opera is so liberating because anything is possible for the exact reason you just outlined, that time does stop. And yeah, you could have someone just stand there and singing an aria, but what character, why shouldn't Onegin appear in Tatiana's bedroom while she's writing that letter and having that big fantasy, even for a moment? And you start thinking that way, and suddenly that's a different kind of listening than what you're talking about, but there's endless opportunities for communicating all of that.
I have a question also for the directors, kind of building off of the question, and we were just talking about this recently, of how like time and with music can kind of stretch and compress, and how something is conducted can have a big effect on a piece dramatically. And so I was wondering if, as directors, you guys talk to conductors ahead of time and kind of, or if in different cases you have different approaches of how to make sure that your interpretations are in line, how, if you give feedback to each other, kind of like how that element works. Because that's something that's not really present in theater.
Absolutely. It's such an important relationship, and the more conversations ahead of time, the better. I mean, directing is 90% casting. I really believe that, and that's your singers, your designers, and your conductor. You're only as good as those people, and then maybe we bring a little 10%. I mean, not to undersell it, but I think, but conducting in particular is just not just tempi, but spirit of the piece. And the more conversation, the better. I pick up the phone a year ahead of time. What cuts do you want to take? What's your interpretation? Even if they're really busy, famous conductors, I try to make sure they sit down and talk about the piece ahead of time. If it's a new piece, they're usually involved in the workshop process. And then again, it's good communication. I always speak up if I think, you know, it might be a little bit too fast for what we're trying to do. I mean, we try it. I mean, that's a really remedial thing. I would never say it's too fast, but just could we take this format a little bit longer? Why make this scene change? And again, it's all about compromise, but it's so important, and you have to talk about those things ahead of time because it can really sabotage the show if it's not good communication with the conductor.
I wanted to hear your point of view exactly on that relationship, but from the point of view of the singer, because I mean, hopefully there's a healthy director-conductor chemistry, but sometimes it's kind of not healthy, and then the singer is kind of in the middle of that triangle. So,
well, ultimately, it's you singing, like you said. It's us. It's a singer out there alone on the stage. we try very hard to kind of collaborate with everybody and make it the best it can be. The tempo is somewhat determined by the conductor. You can't fight that. But you can try to make, if it's against the grain of what the conductor wants, you can try to make the staging work as best you can, or figure out a different way, and it might mean a private conference with the director to make it work if you really have someone who's not going to budge, and vice versa. And I think you have to choose your battles. You have to be quite politique about it so that no one feels like they're being shown disrespect. But you're really just trying to make it work, and I think it can be done in a tasteful, subtle way that A, you can sing it, B, it's going to serve the show and the story, musically as well as dramatically, and you simply have to be gracious about it. That's all I can say. You just be honest and needing help in how you are trying to solve it. And it'll be obvious. It's probably not going to be a subtle thing, but I think you just have to be honest that it's not working on some level and go to the person who can help you. And it might be both.
Yeah, I think integration is really important too, because a lot of directors and conductors approach things like, okay, this is our staging day, so there's no music today. And I don't work that way at all. It's like, well, if we're having a problem with a musical moment, look, take 10 minutes and go work on that, and then we'll take a break and come back and try it again. Or let's end early and you work on the scene that we're going to try the next day. Do you want to sing through it once before we get on our feet? And that's really important, and I think that really respects the conductor's time and their approach to the material.
And I think most conductors I work with, love being in the room and being part of the process. So if they see something happening that they don't understand, or they, they love it, they're laughing, but they're part of that whole creative process. They're like, what? They're throwing ideas out. So, and those are the ideal situations. And I wish they were all that way. But generally, these days, I think most conductors are really into it and love the fact that they get to get their head out of the score and be part of the drama in the way that they aren't always if they're doing orchestral engagements. So I think it's...
And as a director, you really have to work to engage conductors. Not most of them, again, I think things are really going in a positive direction away from that kind of maestro syndrome. But sometimes you have to do work hard to make sure that they feel like they want to be in rehearsal too, and not go talking about subtext in the corner for 2 hours.
Well, sometimes there's a coach that is coaching the singers, and then the conductor comes in towards the, at the very end. That's a little trickier if they haven't been there during the process. I've had great experiences with conductors. I find them to be interesting people in general, and they've got music running through coursing through their mind, body, spirit, and it's good to talk with them and just feel their energy. Sometimes you can't do a whole interpretation by words, but you pick things up by the way they approach their music and the way they talk with singers. Very, very important. So it's a collaboration. Music theater, opera there are a lot of cooks in the pot, and it's you do have to choose your battles and to be willing to collaborate and give a little here, a little bit there, for the greater whole, for the experience of the whole enterprise, because ultimately it should be about some kind of communication on a spiritual level through music, through words, a story well told that reaches us in here. That's what it really is about. And when that happens and that communicates and the whole enterprise lifts, something magical can come into the place, the space where this is all taking place.
I think that is an excellent note on which to end our conversation. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel, and thank you for being here.